Most people misunderstand attraction at its deepest level. They assume it is spoken, explained, or directly shown through clear words. But in real psychological and behavioral observation, especially from a clinical lens, attraction rarely announces itself. It reveals itself slowly, through patterns most people overlook. And in this context, one of the most important truths you need to understand is this: a woman does not test a man with words, she tests him with behavior. Subtle, unconscious behavior. And if you are not trained to read those signals correctly, you can be in front of strong interest and still completely miss it. In this video, we are going to break down those behavioral patterns in a structured way, the same way we would analyze human response patterns in psychology or clinical observation. Not as fantasy, but as measurable human interaction. When a woman is emotionally, mentally, and physically drawn toward a man, she does not typically verbalize it. She does not say, "I am ready," or "I want you." That is not how human emotional signaling works at a deeper level. Instead, her body begins to communicate before her conscious mind fully agrees with what is happening. This is where most men become confused. They look for direct confirmation, while the real signals are already happening in front of them in softer, less obvious ways. In psychological terms, attraction is often nonverbal, and it operates through microexpressions, spatial behavior, tone modulation, and subconscious physical adjustments. What appears as small behavior is often the most accurate indicator of internal emotional state. From an observational standpoint, one of the earliest signs appears in how she positions herself around you. Presence is never random. Human beings, especially when emotionally regulated, maintain distance as a form of control. But when emotional attraction begins to develop, that control weakens in subtle ways. You may notice she sits slightly closer than necessary, or she finds reasons to remain in your space without a clear functional reason. In group settings, her body may gradually orient toward you without conscious awareness. This is not coincidence. This is the body responding to psychological pull before rational thinking intervenes. Alongside proximity, there is another important shift: relaxation of behavioral defenses. A woman who is emotionally neutral or uninterested tends to maintain structured communication. Her tone stays measured, her responses remain controlled, and her emotional output is balanced. But when interest begins to develop, you will often observe a shift in her baseline behavior. Her voice becomes softer without her intentionally lowering it. She becomes more responsive, more open in expression, and slightly more emotionally fluid. She may laugh more easily, smile faster, and show less resistance in communication flow. From a clinical behavioral perspective, this reflects reduced psychological guarding. The nervous system is no longer in full defensive mode around you. Now, one of the most misinterpreted but highly consistent indicators appears in eye behavior. People often assume attraction is expressed through prolonged staring or obvious eye contact. In reality, the stronger indicator is often the opposite. It is the brief interruption of eye contact. She looks at you and then looks away slightly faster than normal. That momentary break, that subtle hesitation, is not disinterest. It is emotional activation followed by controlled withdrawal. Her system reacts before she can regulate it. In simpler terms, she feels something internally, and her behavior tries to conceal it immediately. This is where genuine attraction becomes visible to someone who understands human response patterns. You may also begin to notice additional subconscious cues during interaction. Small gestures that seem unrelated but carry psychological meaning. She might briefly glance at your lips while you are speaking. She may adjust her hair, touch her neck, or lightly interact with areas like her collarbone or face. These are not deliberate signals in most cases. They are autonomic responses linked to emotional arousal and heightened awareness. The body begins to self-regulate when emotional stimulation increases. These are classic nonverbal indicators studied in behavioral psychology, and they often appear before any verbal acknowledgement of interest. And perhaps most importantly, there is a shift in emotional accessibility. A woman who is not emotionally open will maintain conversational distance. She will keep discussions surface level and avoid deeper personal exposure. But when attraction begins to form, she slowly starts revealing more personal information. Not random facts, but emotionally relevant content. Past experiences, emotional wounds, fears, or vulnerabilities begin to surface in conversation. This is not accidental. Emotional disclosure is one of the strongest indicators of trust development. And in human psychology, trust is a prerequisite for deeper attachment. Without it, physical or emotional closeness does not progress further. At this stage, what you are observing is not a single isolated behavior. It is a pattern system. Presence shifts, tone changes, eye behavior adjusts, subconscious gestures increase, and emotional openness expands. Individually, these signs may seem insignificant, but when combined, they form a consistent behavioral profile that indicates internal emotional engagement. Most men miss this entirely because they are waiting for explicit confirmation. But attraction, in its early and most genuine form, does not operate in explicit language. It operates in silence, in timing, in hesitation, and in subtle physical and emotional alignment. This is where we pause for now. In the next part, we will go deeper into how emotional imagination, behavioral testing, and psychological projection begin to shape her actions when attraction intensifies, and why most men completely misread this phase. Continuing from the behavioral patterns discussed earlier, the next layer of understanding becomes even more important because this is where attraction stops being passive observation and starts becoming active psychological engagement. At this stage, what you are seeing is no longer just subtle presence shifts or eye behavior changes. You begin to see how emotional imagination and internal testing shape her responses toward you. From a clinical behavioral perspective, this is where cognitive emotional overlap becomes visible. In simple terms, she is no longer only reacting to you in real time, she is also reacting to thoughts of you when you are not physically influencing her environment. One of the key indicators at this stage is how she begins to mentally project scenarios involving you. This is not necessarily verbalized in a direct way, but it appears through the way she structures conversation. She may ask indirect hypothetical questions or bring up what-if type situations. Questions like how you would behave in certain future contexts, or how you view relationships and emotional decisions, are not casual. They are psychological assessment tools. She is not asking because she lacks understanding. She is asking because she is mapping compatibility. In behavioral psychology, this is a form of cognitive testing, where emotional safety and long-term stability are evaluated through indirect questioning rather than direct inquiry. At the same time, you will notice an increase in emotional responsiveness that feels slightly inconsistent. This is an important phase to understand correctly. A woman who is emotionally neutral remains predictable. Her responses are stable, her energy is consistent, and her engagement level does not fluctuate significantly. But when emotional attraction begins to deepen, internal conflict can create variation in behavior. She may appear highly engaged in one moment and slightly distant in another. From a psychological standpoint, this is not confusion in the simplistic sense. It is emotional regulation in progress. One part of her system is moving toward attachment, while another part is still attempting to maintain control and emotional protection. This is also where changes in group behavior become noticeable. In neutral settings, she may behave in a socially balanced way, distributing attention evenly. However, when emotional interest is present, her focus subtly shifts. She may become more attentive to your reactions than to the group dynamic itself. Even in conversations involving multiple people, her attention may repeatedly return to you without conscious intent. This is not about exclusion of others, but about priority shifting in attention allocation. Human attention is limited, and when emotional relevance increases, it naturally reorganizes itself toward the perceived source of emotional significance. Another key behavioral layer involves subtle physical closeness combined with situational comfort. She may begin to position herself in ways that reduce physical distance, not in an obvious or invasive manner, but in small, repeated adjustments. Sitting slightly closer, turning her body toward you in shared environments, or remaining within your conversational space longer than necessary. What makes this significant is not the proximity itself, but the lack of resistance to it. When emotional interest is absent, distance is maintained almost automatically. When interest is present, that boundary becomes more flexible, often without her actively realizing it. Touch behavior also becomes more meaningful at this stage, but it must be interpreted carefully. These are not large or dramatic gestures. They are brief, light, and context-based interactions. A momentary touch on the arm during conversation, a small adjustment of clothing, or incidental contact that is not immediately withdrawn from. In behavioral terms, the key observation is not the touch itself, but the reaction to it. If physical contact is consistently neutral or comfortably sustained rather than avoided, it indicates a level of psychological acceptance of proximity. The nervous system does not maintain prolonged comfort with unwanted contact. It withdraws. So sustained neutrality or continuation becomes an important marker. Another subtle but highly relevant indicator is the emergence of emotional contrast in her behavior around you compared to others. In general social environments, she may appear composed, controlled, and socially regulated. However, around a person she is emotionally drawn to, there is often a noticeable shift in expressiveness. She may become more playful, more reactive, or even slightly more self-conscious. This variation is not randomness. It reflects heightened emotional awareness. In clinical observation, this is often described as affective modulation, where emotional output becomes more variable in response to a specific individual. A particularly important behavioral pattern at this stage is what can be described as emotional push and pull. She may become more engaged and then briefly withdraw, only to re-engage again with increased intensity. This cycle is often misinterpreted as indecision, but in psychological terms, it reflects internal emotional regulation conflict. The attraction system is activating connection, while the protective system attempts to maintain emotional safety. This creates oscillation in behavior. The stronger the emotional relevance, the more noticeable this fluctuation can become, especially in individuals who are naturally more emotionally aware or cautious. At the same time, observation behavior becomes more refined. She begins to study you in a quieter, more consistent way, not in an obvious staring manner, but through brief, repeated attention. She notices patterns in how you speak, how you respond to stress, how you behave in different emotional contexts. This is not superficial interest. This is evaluative attention. In psychological terms, this represents compatibility assessment through behavioral mapping. She is building a mental profile of emotional reliability, stability, and responsiveness. As this phase develops further, the emotional connection becomes less about isolated signals and more about continuity of behavior over time. Attraction is no longer just a momentary reaction. It becomes a sustained psychological engagement pattern. And at this point, the signs are no longer individual cues, but an interconnected system of emotional, behavioral, and physiological responses that consistently point in one direction, increasing emotional investment. In the next part, we will move into deeper territory, focusing on trust-based behavior, emotional prioritization, and the point at which psychological comfort begins to override hesitation, leading to full emotional alignment. As we move deeper into the behavioral progression, the focus shifts from surface-level attraction indicators into something far more important: trust formation and emotional dependency cues. At this stage, what you are observing is no longer just interest or curiosity. It is the gradual restructuring of emotional priorities. From a psychological standpoint, this is where attachment begins to stabilize, and behavior becomes less about testing and more about alignment. One of the most significant signs at this stage is the increasing weight of your presence in her decision-making process. A woman who is emotionally neutral or not invested will not adjust her behavior significantly based on your opinion. But when emotional connection strengthens, your perspective starts to matter more than it objectively should in casual interaction. This does not mean dependency in an extreme sense, but rather a shift in reference point. She begins to consider your reaction before making small social or personal choices, which is a clear indicator of emerging emotional prioritization. In behavioral psychology, this is often described as influence sensitivity. It is not about control, but about emotional relevance. When someone becomes emotionally important, their feedback carries more internal weight. You may notice she asks your opinion more often, or subtly checks your reaction before finalizing a thought or decision in conversation. This is not coincidence. It reflects a developing internal hierarchy, where your presence has been assigned greater emotional significance than before. At the same time, trust-based behaviors become more visible. Trust in this context is not limited to verbal statements. It is expressed through comfort in emotional exposure. She begins to reveal more personal aspects of her inner world without being prompted. This may include past experiences, emotional discomforts, insecurities, or reflective thoughts she does not share with others easily. From a clinical perspective, emotional disclosure is one of the strongest indicators of psychological safety. Humans do not open up deeply unless they perceive reduced risk of judgment or emotional harm. Another important layer is behavioral forgiveness and emotional softness. You may observe that she becomes less reactive to minor misunderstandings or small emotional discomforts around you. Situations that might normally trigger withdrawal or irritation in neutral dynamics are handled with more patience. This is not about ignoring issues, but about emotional tolerance increasing due to attachment. In attachment theory, this is often seen when emotional security begins to override defensive responses. Alongside this, there is a clear change in emotional expression patterns. Her communication becomes more emotionally nuanced. Tone variation increases, responses carry more emotional weight, and interactions feel less mechanical and more personally invested. Even simple conversations begin to carry subtle emotional undertones. This is because emotional engagement is no longer surface-based. It is now internally integrated into how she processes interaction with you. A key behavioral marker at this stage is consistency of engagement. Earlier phases often include fluctuation, where attention may rise and fall. But as trust develops, engagement becomes more stable. She maintains communication more consistently, responds with greater emotional presence, and shows reduced detachment in interaction. This stability is important because it reflects reduced internal resistance. In psychological terms, the conflict between attraction and self-protection begins to decrease, allowing more consistent emotional expression. You may also notice increased emotional alignment in shared moments. When a woman begins to trust someone deeply, she unconsciously synchronizes aspects of her behavior. This includes mirroring tone, matching conversational rhythm, and aligning emotional responses more closely with yours. This is not imitation in a conscious sense. It is a natural byproduct of emotional attunement, where the nervous system begins to align with someone perceived as emotionally safe or significant. Another subtle but important sign is her growing sensitivity to your emotional state. She begins to notice shifts in your mood more quickly and may respond to them even without explicit communication. If you are quieter than usual, she reacts. If your tone changes slightly, she picks up on it. This increased emotional awareness is not random attentiveness. It reflects psychological investment. When someone becomes emotionally important, their internal state becomes relevant to the observer. At this point, you also begin to see a shift in how she positions herself in relational dynamics. She becomes more receptive to guidance in conversation, more open to your direction in shared decisions, and less resistant to your influence in small, everyday interactions. This does not indicate submission in a simplistic sense, but rather comfort in allowing your presence to shape shared experiences. In psychological terms, this reflects increasing relational trust. However, one of the most misunderstood aspects of this stage is emotional inconsistency during deepening attachment. Even as trust increases, occasional fluctuations may still appear. She may briefly withdraw, become quieter, or appear internally conflicted at times. This is not regression. It is the final phase of emotional adjustment, where the nervous system is fully integrating attachment while still processing vulnerability risks. As this stage progresses, emotional investment becomes more structured and less uncertain. Behavior becomes increasingly centered around maintaining connection, even in subtle ways. At this point, attraction is no longer just about signals. It is about sustained emotional positioning, where she begins to place you within her internal emotional framework in a more stable and meaningful way. In the next part, we will go deeper into physical proximity cues, subconscious touch behavior, and how emotional trust begins to manifest in body language that becomes increasingly difficult to consciously control. As we move further into the progression of emotional attachment, the signals become less about conversation and more about physical presence and subconscious body behavior. At this stage, what we are observing is no longer just emotional alignment in thought or trust in communication. It begins to manifest directly through spatial behavior, physical proximity, and involuntary body language. From a psychological perspective, this is where internal emotional states start to express themselves externally in a more visible and measurable way. One of the clearest indicators at this stage is consistent physical closeness. When a woman is emotionally neutral, she naturally maintains a balanced personal space boundary. Distance is preserved, not out of hostility, but out of psychological neutrality. However, when emotional attachment deepens, that boundary begins to shift. She starts positioning herself closer to you in shared environments, often without conscious realization. This closeness is not abrupt or obvious. It is gradual, subtle, and repeated over time. She may sit slightly nearer, stand within your conversational space longer, or adjust her position in ways that reduce distance between you. In behavioral psychology, this is linked to proximity-seeking behavior, which is a well-documented indicator of emotional preference. Humans instinctively move closer to what feels emotionally significant or safe. This is not a calculated decision. It is a nervous system response. When emotional comfort increases around a specific person, physical distance becomes less rigid and more flexible. Alongside proximity, touch behavior becomes more noticeable, but still subtle in nature. These are not overt or dramatic gestures. Instead, they appear as brief, low-intensity physical interactions. A light touch on the arm during conversation, a brief adjustment of clothing, or incidental contact that is not immediately avoided. What matters here is not the presence of touch alone, but the absence of withdrawal. When contact is unwanted, the body typically reacts with immediate distancing. But when emotional comfort exists, that reaction softens or disappears entirely. Another important behavioral marker is the increased duration of physical contact. Even small interactions may last slightly longer than necessary. For example, a hand that touches your arm may not immediately pull away. A brief moment of contact becomes extended by a fraction of a second. While this may seem minor, in behavioral observation, timing differences in withdrawal response are significant indicators of comfort and emotional acceptance. At the same time, body orientation becomes more aligned. Even when in group settings, her posture subtly adjusts toward you. This includes the direction of shoulders, torso alignment, and head positioning during conversation. These adjustments are rarely conscious. They are driven by attentional focus. When someone becomes emotionally relevant, the body naturally orients itself toward that source of engagement. In psychology, this is often described as directional attention behavior, where physical orientation reflects internal focus. You may also observe increased mirroring behavior. This is when she begins to unconsciously match aspects of your body language, such as posture, sitting style, gestures, or conversational rhythm. Mirroring is a well-established indicator of rapport and emotional connection. It is not imitation for appearance, but synchronization at a subconscious level. The nervous system begins to align behavior patterns with someone perceived as emotionally significant or safe. Another key sign at this stage is comfort in silence. When emotional attachment is weak or absent, silence often feels uncomfortable, and people tend to fill it with unnecessary speech. However, when emotional trust is present, silence becomes neutral or even comforting. She may sit beside you without needing constant conversation, showing no urgency to break the quiet. This type of shared silence is a strong indicator of psychological ease, where presence alone is enough to maintain emotional comfort. Facial expression dynamics also become more expressive in this phase. You may notice softer expressions, more frequent microsmiles, and increased emotional responsiveness in facial cues. Her reactions become more immediate and less filtered. Even small interactions may trigger visible emotional responses, such as subtle smiles, lowered gaze, or brief moments of shyness. These expressions are not performed consciously. They are spontaneous outputs of emotional processing. Another important layer is protective behavior toward the interaction itself. When emotional attachment increases, she may begin to subtly guard the connection from external interference. This can appear as increased attentiveness when other people are present, or slight shifts in behavior when outside attention is directed toward the interaction. In psychological terms, this reflects emerging relational significance, where the connection is internally categorized as important enough to protect emotionally. You may also notice increased responsiveness to your physical presence even before direct interaction occurs. Her behavior may shift when you enter a space, even if no conversation begins immediately. This is a key indicator of anticipatory emotional response. The body reacts before verbal engagement begins, which suggests that your presence has already been encoded as emotionally relevant at a subconscious level. At this stage, emotional trust and physical comfort begin to merge. The separation between emotional attachment and physical behavior becomes less distinct. Proximity feels natural, touch feels safe, and presence feels grounding. These combined indicators show that emotional alignment is no longer theoretical or internal only. It is now reflected consistently in physical behavior patterns. In the final part, we will focus on the last stage of this progression, where emotional surrender becomes fully visible through behavior, consistency, priority shifts, and complete psychological comfort in your presence. At this final stage of behavioral progression, what we are observing is no longer simple attraction signals or early emotional bonding patterns. This is the phase where emotional attachment becomes stable, consistent, and deeply integrated into behavior. From a psychological standpoint, this is where internal comfort, trust, and emotional reliance begin to shape nearly every interaction pattern. The signals are no longer scattered or subtle in isolation. They form a clear, continuous behavioral framework that reflects emotional prioritization. One of the most defining indicators at this stage is availability behavior. A woman who is emotionally neutral or minimally invested will treat time and communication as flexible and optional. But when emotional attachment becomes strong, her availability begins to shift naturally around the person she is connected to. She may prioritize conversations, adjust her schedule slightly, or find ways to remain engaged even during busy periods. This is not about obligation. It is about emotional relevance influencing time allocation. In behavioral psychology, this is known as priority reorganization, where emotionally significant individuals begin to occupy a higher position in daily cognitive planning. Another important sign is consistency of engagement, even without external stimulation. Earlier phases often depend on active interaction to maintain connection. But at this stage, even absence does not fully disconnect emotional focus. She may think about the person in their absence, respond quickly when communication resumes, and maintain continuity in emotional tone. This reflects internalized attachment, where the emotional link is no longer dependent on constant external input to remain active. You will also notice a shift in emotional softness and behavioral openness. Her expressions become more natural and less guarded. There is reduced emotional resistance in communication, and interactions feel smoother and more fluid. She may express concern, care, or interest more freely without overanalyzing how it appears. In psychological terms, this is a reduction in self-monitoring behavior, which typically decreases when emotional safety increases. Another key marker at this stage is increased emotional investment in your well-being. She becomes more attentive to your mood, energy, and general state. If there is a change in your behavior, even a subtle one, she is more likely to notice and respond to it. This is not surface-level observation. It reflects emotional attunement, where another person's internal state becomes relevant to her own emotional regulation. This is one of the strongest indicators of attachment formation. At the same time, physical comfort reaches its highest level. Proximity no longer requires adjustment or hesitation. Sitting close, standing nearby, or sharing personal space becomes natural and unforced. Touch, if present, is no longer incidental or tested. It becomes part of normal interaction flow, without withdrawal or tension. The nervous system no longer perceives closeness as a potential threat or uncertainty. One of the most significant behavioral shifts at this stage is willingness to be alone with you without hesitation. This is a major psychological marker. When emotional trust reaches a high level, being in private or quiet settings no longer creates discomfort. Instead, it becomes desirable or neutral. She does not feel the need to constantly maintain external social buffers. In clinical observation, this reflects strong relational safety, where the presence of another person is no longer perceived as risky or uncertain. Another subtle but powerful sign is emotional vulnerability without hesitation. She may express thoughts, feelings, or concerns more openly, even if they are imperfect or emotionally sensitive. There is less fear of judgment and more willingness to be understood. This level of openness indicates that emotional defenses are significantly lowered in your presence. At this point, behavioral consistency becomes very important. The fluctuations seen in earlier stages, distance followed by closeness, hesitation followed by engagement, begin to stabilize. Her behavior becomes more predictable in its emotional direction, even if small variations still exist. The overall pattern, however, leans consistently toward connection rather than withdrawal. You may also observe subtle, future oriented thinking in conversation.